Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of the Nomad Millionaire. Today we will be reacting to Gary's economics. He's clearly a very intelligent guy. He's sort of identified the same problem as we are seeing, and we differ a lot from the solutions. But he's made this video about that's going viral, how to stop the economy from collapsing, and we just want to bring our take on it, where we might think something is different, where we think something a different solution at least than what he is proposing. So let's get into it.
Hey, welcome back to Gary's Economics. Today we are finally going to explain how we can stop the economy from collapsing. Okay, so in the last couple of months I've been on tour. I've been up and down the country a couple of times. We've had a massive press campaign, so I've been all over the TV, radio, the internet, basically explaining that the economy is collapsing, that it will continue to collapse, and that ordinary families will be driven into poverty, that our kids and our grandkids won't be able to afford homes and financial security. And we've been getting a lot of press, and that has obviously been basically worrying a lot of people. People should be worried because this
We completely agree on his problem he has identified here. The fact that it's getting harder and harder for average person to build any wealth or to get to just a level of financial freedom.
happening. And people are asking me, okay, Gary, what can we do? How can we stop that? And I've spent quite a lot of time explaining the problem, but perhaps not so much explaining what we can do to stop the problem. So today, what I'm going to try my best to do is explain really clearly, as much as possible from the ground up, how I think we can stop this economic collapse from happening. All right, so the very first thing we need to do is just recap very quickly what the economic problem actually is in its most basic terms, and I'm going to try to explain that in a simple diagram, which I'm going to draw here. Okay, so we've got these four groups in society. We've got the working class, we've got the middle class, we've got the government, and we've got the rich.
Okay, so already here we differ a bit. I actually think that in current society, what we're seeing when we do all the analysis of different countries, especially the Western world, US, UK, Germany, these places, what we actually see is that the middle class has been eroded. So you're either in the working class or you are in the sort of capital class, or he calls it the rich here, right? But the capital class is what we call it, where you're sort of like driving a lot of your wealth from owning assets. And the other thing where you're trying to drive wealth from going to work. So we actually only identify three: the government, the working class, labor class, and the capital class. And those three are always who has the most leverage in society that we're trying to figure out. Let's continue.
Now, for most of history and in most of the world today, pretty much all of the wealth in society, the land, the property, the natural resources, the businesses, are owned by the rich. But for a period of time after the Second World War, we had a situation where basically all of these groups held a decent amount of wealth. So in my parents' generation, it was normal for even working class families to have a pension and own their own property, for example. So we had a period where all of these groups had a decent amount of wealth. But the rich...
Okay, so here our framework essentially comes into play. He's of course outlining the fact that in the past it used to be that the working class or the labor class was doing much better compared to today. The asset class was still doing well, but there was not the same type of disparity between being either in the asset holders or being in the working class. And so what we actually think has happened is that in society, what's always going on is labor versus capital. They are sort of like who has the most leverage against people, against each other, essentially. That's the thing we're trying to look at in society. And back in the day, labor has a lot more leverage, because if labor didn't show up, nothing was being produced. If you own the means of production, what you want is something to be produced. As technology over the last 30 years really has ramped up due to the internet, all these things starting to happen, really technological progress that is going faster and faster, what we're seeing is the capital has much more leverage every year. And sadly, we're not seeing that trend stop. We're actually seeing only get worse, which hence why we started the Nomad Millionaire, is to actually just really say to people that you really need to start getting from labor class to capital class by using your salary as a weapon to build wealth. Now, let's already continue to say, just to explain why it's gotten so bad for the labor class versus the asset class. And that is just, it simply comes down to the framework of the fact that the labor doesn't have the same leverage anymore that it used to have.
But the rich had more, and especially after their taxes were cut in the 80s, they started to accumulate more and more. And that meant that when other groups in society wanted to access this wealth, wanted to use this wealth, wanted to use housing, property, natural resources, buildings, they had to pay rents, profits, dividends to the rich. And wealth started to flow away from these other groups and towards the rich. And these flows really started to increase, especially during the 2008 crisis and during the COVID crisis. And it led to a situation.
Correct. Again, here he's identifying the fact that during crises, what happens is, the government starts to print a lot more capital and start to hand it out inside. We saw that during COVID, right? And what then happens is people go out and spend it because they haven't taught their muscle to save up all the money they actually get. That is why we started the Nomad Millionaire steps. If you follow those and you get to a net savings rate of 50%, you have to save up 50% of your salary every month. You're not giving it away. You are paying yourself first before you start paying everybody else. And that is, of course, a muscle we have to train. But correct, during crises, what we're seeing is actually that the disparity in wealth between the rich and the poor, the working class versus the capital class, gets larger and larger.
Situation where really there was very large scale transfer of wealth, and that is still ongoing. And the end result was that the working class lost pretty much all their wealth and got into a bit of debt as well. The government is now massively in negative wealth, so they've only got debt. And the middle class, they kept some of their wealth, but not so much. And the wealth of the rich just got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, especially during COVID. What this meant was, because these groups of society, who traditionally are the big spenders in terms of proportion of their wealth, were losing their wealth, spending fell, wages fell, and because these guys have much more wealth now and these guys have less, these transfer payments which you have to make to use wealth, access resources, went up because you've got less resources now, they've got more, so you need to pay to use a greater amount of resources. So these flows increased, and now we're in a situation where basically these groups are basically wiped out. The working class has basically nothing left. These guys already live in increasingly desperate poverty. The government is like totally bankrupted. They're out. And the middle class has just this little bit left, which they're hanging on to, but it's gradually being sucked out, and before long they will be gone too. And then you end up in this situation where basically the rich own everything, you have no middle class, nobody else owns anything, and an economy like that looks like Nigeria, looks like India.
Well, that is actually true. And we are going towards a society where a lot of people won't own anything. We've seen that in first-time home buyers continues to rise every year. In places like London, you're 45 on average to buy a first home. It used to be 25 to 35 to 30. Now we have 45 to 50. And it will only continue to rise for the average person. So Charles Schwab, which is a very famous economist from the EU region, he was actually out saying that you'll own nothing and be happy. And that is where we are trending. And I don't think you'll be happy when you own nothing, because you always sort of rely on the government. Hence why we think you have to take care of yourself. Hence why we think you have to start today saving up 50% of your net salary every month. And we know there's a lot of things that has to be true for you to save up 50%. Hence why we made the Nomad Millionaire steps. Thank you, guys.
India looks like Brazil, and basically you have very broad poverty. If you want to fix this, you need to get wealth flowing back in the other direction. And there are different ways to do this. In theory, you can do it without taxes. And if you are interested in non-tax solutions for getting ordinary families their wealth back, we have a video called The Wealth Time Limit, which I did years ago. But realistically, I think your only realistic hope of getting the wealth back in the working class, back in the middle class, getting wealth to flow away from the rich, is, to quote the Dutch historian Rutger Bregman, taxes, taxes, taxes. I do really think this is the only way.
Okay. This is where, he has now identified the problem. And we actually completely agree with his whole approach to the problem. We might think there's some small things. But overall, we completely agree on the fact that he thinks that the problem is there. He's outlined it, and we agree it's a huge problem. Taxing the rich, we've tried that before. We've seen it in France. We've seen it in Norway. What happened in France when they introduced wealth tax and all? People moved to Switzerland, and they moved to Belgium, and they moved to Dubai, and they moved... We saw it in Norway as well. They introduced wealth tax, all these things. People moved to Italy, people moved to Switzerland, people moved to Dubai, and so forth. So we've tried that thing before. And what we think you have to do is, you have to do what the rich is doing. Right? You have to adopt the thing they are doing. And what are they doing? They are investing every month. You have to invest every month. Now, is that not possible where you live today? Probably not. Because you can look at all of our case studies, and what we go to show is that the cost of living is rising a lot faster than your salary. So that ends up like 70% of young UK people live paycheck to paycheck. So it's just the society is not working out anymore, and you just have to realize that.
I know it's difficult because the rich will oppose it, but I think unless we can get much higher levels of tax on the rich, I don't think there is any way we can get that wealth back to working class and middle class families. So if we're talking about tax, I always think when we are discussing the question of how can we tax the rich more, tax working families less, get wealth flowing back to working class families, I always think it's really, really helpful to break that question of tax down into two completely separate questions. Question one, what specific changes do we want in the tax system? And question two, how do we make those changes happen? And the reason why I think it's really important to separate them is because these are really just two completely separate questions. This number one is a question of, really, it's a technical question. It's a tax advisor's, it's a tax planner's question. It's a technical economics question. And number two is a question of power. It's a question of how do we force these things. And the reason why I think it's really, really important to separate them is because we tend to focus very, very much on this question one, especially when we are talking to people like me who are economists. We want to say, okay, well, what are the changes in the tax system? What are the changes in the tax system? And I think this is perhaps a little bit naive to the fact that basically at the moment we are losing this debate for question two, which is at the moment we're not getting any taxes at all. We are increasingly seeing changes in the tax system which tax rich people less, which tax working people more. That is true even in countries that have centre-left governments who you might think would be more supportive of poorer people. It's true here in the UK. We have a Labour government. It was true under Joe Biden. We are seeing...
He's correct about this as well, right? Which is why we also don't think it's working. If you're seeing the average tax rate for wealthy people in the US, UK, most of Europe, what you'll find is that the rich are paying on average much less taxes as a percentage of what they make versus the bit more the working class. A lot of society, we're not good at incentivizing in the UK, Europe, US, that you create any income. I'm a Dane and I can explain, in Denmark, essentially what we say is if you go to work, we tax that very high, 50% to 65% based on where you are. And if you gamble or sort of invest in a home and that thing goes up, we don't pay anything in taxes. So what we're saying to people is gamble your way there. Don't work your way there, right? So we think, of course, like these places have not been good at incentivizing people to go to work and to actually make income, because that's the thing we tax the highest. We don't think it makes any sense. That is also why we created Nomad Millionaire, is to say there is a different path for you. So he's completely correct. The only difference here again is he thinks he can change it. And what we're saying is by the time it has changed, let's say it actually does change down the line, it's probably too late for you because this will take 20, 30, 40 years before it happens. And we don't have that time. We have to do it now. AI is coming, putting even more pressure on these things. We don't see this stopping. And yeah, again, you can try and tax the rich. You can try and put on, but they will move. Because it's much easier for the rich to move than it is for, or at least that's the perception, than it is for everybody else, because they have the means to do it, and they can put up bank accounts there, bank accounts there. We don't think that is the solution.
Even under governments that are supposed to be left-wing, the inability to raise taxes at all. So I think it's really important to recognise that these two things are separate, because we can often end up in a situation where somebody like me is trying to make a very strong case for the fact that if we don't change the tax system, we will see basically a collapse of society. And somebody who perhaps is rich or is funded by the rich will come in and say, aha, but what specific changes do you want to make? And they will ask you to sort of sit down and carefully plan a brand new tax system right there in front of them. And then they will say, oh, well, this specific problem is wrong and this is not going to work. Listen, I am not particularly passionate about the specific form of tax that we take. I'm aware that it is really, really important that this is carefully designed to hit the richest rather than the middle class. I'm totally aware of this problem. And I'm aware that different forms of taxes will have different problems. And I'm aware that we need to be really, really careful about how we plan it, how we design it. But the truth is, the most important thing is that we get a change. And there are a number of forms that change could take. I campaign for wealth taxes. Some people campaign for equalising capital gains with income tax. Some people talk about closing down the loopholes that very rich families use to pay zero taxes. These are all good plans, but I don't think we should let the perfect be the enemy of the good. The truth is, we are losing this battle for question 2. And if we lose this battle for question 2, then your family will be bankrupted. So I came into this game, as an economist who thought a lot about question 1. And I kind of became a campaigner, a YouTuber. I literally taught myself how to write a book because I could see we were going to lose question 2. So I am going to focus for the rest of this video on question 2. The only thing I'll say about question 1 is I think we need to deal with the fact that some people say there's no point trying to tax the rich because reducing inequality is impossible. And the answer to that is 100% it is possible, because we did it in the 20th century. In the beginning of the 20th century, inequality in this country, across Europe, across the United States was extremely high, and ordinary families like yours and mine lived in desperate poverty. And over the course of the 20th century, we reduced wealth inequality really significantly. That got wealth into the hands of ordinary families, and it led to really significant increases in living standards, which meant that our parents and grandparents lived much, much better lives than people in the early 20th century did. So for now, we need to focus on...
Again, we think he's not thinking about the technological things that has happened and the thing we're looking into. That's our opinion.
Getting some form of change, because if we spend all of our time arguing about the specific form of the change, we won't get anything at all. There's no point arguing about battle tactics until you have an army. So let's talk about how can we force these politicians to give us the things that we need. All right, so I, as most of you will know if you've been watching this channel, was an economist, mathematician, and a trader. I worked as a trader from 2008 to 2014. I made a lot of money by recognizing basically exactly the diagram I showed you at the beginning of the video, which was that wealth was and still is being drained out of the middle class, out of the working class, accumulated by the very rich. That was going to suck spending power out of the economy, and that was going to impoverish most ordinary families. I bet on that, and I was very successful betting that the economy would collapse, and I made a lot of money on that. And I quit trading in 2014. I was living in Tokyo at the time, and I came back to London basically with this conviction that I was right in this relatively simple economic understanding that we would see continued further and further and further worsening of living standards. And I didn't want that to happen. I don't want it to happen. I assume you don't want that to happen, because it will mean poverty for you and your kids. And my plan was basically simply to come back to London and show people this truth. And I've been spending basically those nearly 11 years now since I came back trying to figure out how can we actually stop this crisis from happening. And my plan has always been, really relatively simply, this crisis will impoverish 70, 80, 90% of the population here in the UK, in the US, in Australia, in Europe, wherever you're watching. And you're seeing that happening. You are seeing larger and larger percentages of the population being impoverished. And it doesn't make sense for the public to accept that. So all we need to do is show them what's happening, make it clear to them what's happening, and they will reject it, basically. But it's been 11 years now, and we haven't achieved it yet. So I would like to...
So he's been on this journey for 11 years. And to be honest, in those 11 years, it's gotten a lot worse. Again, we have a case study around the UK. There is a link to it in the bottom of this video that exactly shows you the data of how worse it's gotten in the last 11 years. And there is no sign of this stopping. So again, we completely agree on his mission here. And if we think that the solution was that you guys just, that somehow this will all change and suddenly the rich will start to somehow get the wealth back into the hands of the middle class and the working class, we just don't think that's the case. We think the only solution is that people have to join the capital class. They have to save up capital every month, and then they can start to get the benefits of that. And yeah, for a lot of you that won't be able to do that, living in London, living in Bristol, living in Birmingham, living in Liverpool, living in Germany, living in Munich, we are aware of that fact. It will be a lot more difficult.
I have to explain basically how my thinking has developed and refined into trying to figure out a way that we can really effectively stop it. So when I first came back, the first place I went to was I worked for an economics think tank in London called the New Economics Foundation. I volunteered there for about 6 months. This is a progressive economics think tank in London. I kind of figured that these would be the guys who would help you sort of introduce new economics ideas into society. Their name was literally the New Economics Foundation. And I volunteered there for 6 months. I met a lot of nice people. Some of them I'm still friends with now. But I basically became convinced that they didn't really have the capacity to really push this new idea out. There was very, very little appetite for ideas on inequality. They needed to get funding for all of their individual projects. And, they could get a lot of funding for global warming stuff and kind of identity politics stuff, but there was basically nobody funding wealth inequality stuff. The space was quite middle class. So in many cases, there were people who were not themselves being directly hurt. I make the point a lot on this channel, and I think this is important to recognize. Crises of inequality, they impoverish 90% of the population, but they make like 1-2% of the population absolutely really bloody rich, and these guys, they benefit from it. And there's another sort of 3-4% below that are pretty well protected, and I sort of found in that think tank space, a lot of these protected people basically. And unfortunately, whilst they are in many cases very well meaning, I didn't see any chance of getting change essentially from that think tank space. So I went then to university. I did a 2-year economics master's at Oxford, and you could probably imagine if the think tank space was quite rich and quite upper middle class, the Oxford University was unbelievably rich and middle class. And good luck to anyone who's trying to make change in academia, and we do need people in those spaces. I became pretty convinced that academia was almost completely a dead end at the moment. I think we've made videos on this. I think the situation of university, especially elite university academic economics, is just, if the situation wasn't so serious, it would be quite funny, really. You've got a lot of very smart kids like locked in tiny windowless rooms doing unbelievably complicated mathematics.
Again, here, I think what he's of course outlining here and what we will say is that nobody's going to do this for you. You have to take matter in your own hand here. You have to make a plan that works for you. You have to identify the problem. That is step one, right? Step two is then to get to a plan where you're saving up 50% of your salary for at least 5 years, and then you are joining the capital class. You might not join it at the same level as a lot of these others, but you at least will recognize the same type of trends as they are.
With absolutely no idea what's happening in the world. So I don't think that we're going to make change from those spaces. I eventually decided to try and move into the media space. I made that space in early 2020. And the idea was basically, I've spent 5-6 years now trying to convince rich people to deal with inequality. I don't think they're going to do it. The people who are affected by and hurt by this economic crisis of inequality are ordinary families like you, ordinary families like your kids. And I was hoping that in the media space, I might be able to basically speak to the people who are being hurt, speak to people who are being affected, instead of speaking to the rich guys who are benefiting. And that is really when I started to develop the plan that I've been doing the last 4 years, especially the last 2-3 years, which is I genuinely think that the vast majority of people in this country, and I think this is true if you're here or in the States or in Europe or Australia, do not have a single person in the mainstream media who is communicating effectively, clearly, understandably what is happening in this economic crisis that is increasingly devastating living conditions for millions of ordinary families across the world. And I started to feel that there was a massive gap, basically, like a huge gap to fill, basically telling people what's happening. And I started to feel that really strongly during COVID, that basically the quality of our economic media was extremely low. The quality of our politics from an economics perspective was extremely low. And we were, because of those failures, we were going to see a continuation of falling living standards, but we were going to see this enormous unmet demand for somebody who is simply talking about and explaining what is actually happening in the economy. Okay, so let's talk about what is happening in economics and politics. I think you basically have two strands of economic thought and two strands of political thought, which is you have this kind of old school, the kind of dominant economic ideology of the last 34 years, which is really, I think, personified by the current Labour government, which is if we just do everything a little bit more efficiently, things will get better. There's no explicit focus on inequality at all. They often tend to focus on trying to change the system in such a way that it benefits the rich, which means inequality tends to get worse over time. And living standards fall for the majority, while this kind of semi-elite group of politicians and economists themselves are protected. This is really clearly dying. You can see it in the complete collapse in support for almost all of the traditional centre-left and centre-right parties across Europe. Those parties are only really hanging on in the UK and the US under systems which basically make it almost impossible to replace them. And you're seeing even in those countries, those parties become extremely unpopular and die. That creates this massive gap for new ideas. So I think we are here in this space now. There is a massive popular demand for new ideas. And really, the political left has almost completely failed to put any new ideas on the table. And that gap is being filled by a new political right, which I think has been very effective in doing things like utilising social media, utilising influencers, especially on the right, to basically sell a new political story. And they are, in a sense, taking advantage of the exact same thing which I've just described to you, which is that politics has failed, media has failed. There is massive demand for something which...
Again here, now he's starting to talk about the politics, right? And what has happened, if we boil it down, in the places where the most center-left, call it that type of, where sort of like social dominated politics are actually placing, like UK, like US for many years. Most of the time it's been Democrats winning in the US. Most of the time it's been Labour winning in the UK, and same in Germany. And it's not been sort of right wing. Let's not. It's been a lot of the places where we're seeing the worst disparity between the rich and the poor or the working class. Has nothing to do with it being a center-right government, for example. That's not at all what we're seeing. What we're seeing is globalism in general has simply just collapsed. Wages due to technological benefits and due to low-cost workers around the world that all corporations are taking advantage of, and of course they are, and they will continue to do so. And when they don't need people at all anymore, and it's just robots, it will go even further than that, right? So if you are in the working class today, again, it's hard to see how this changes. But so it's just not been a good environment for the working class, and it won't be so in the future either. The only solution is to join the capital class.
Is new because people know that the status quo is failing, and these guys are filling that gap with the problem is foreigners, the problem is immigrants, and they will be very successful. They clearly have taken power of the US government. They will increasingly take control of European governments, and they have taken control of many European governments. They are successful, I think, not necessarily because they are good. I think simply because no one else has really tried to occupy that gap. I think there is massive demand for and massive potential for a simple message delivered to working people. The reason you are getting poor is because your wealth is being squeezed out by the rich and the super rich. They are taking the wealth from you. You are unable to compete with them. The working class is being bankrupted. The middle class is disappearing. Tax, wealth, not work. I honestly think we have a chance of winning power on that. And I think in this country, in the short term, because we have this centrist party in power, our problem is how do we squeeze the centre on that? And I think the power we have is that the centre is, number one, phenomenally unpopular, and number two, will fail in the economy. So I think we really have power there. The longer term risk is not the centre, because I think the centre will progressively lose popularity, but these new right ideas. The problem we have is that they will always be much, much, much better funded than us. Quite simply because once billionaires realise that the long-term battle is a battle between tax the rich and blame the foreigners, the billionaires will increasingly aggressively fund blame the foreigners as an idea. But we do also have a kind of trump card against this new right, which is, when it comes to economic policy, almost all of these new right parties want to slash taxes on rich people. And I think that's partly ideological, and I think it's partly because they're funded by billionaires, and that's what the billionaires want. Which means that even in the cases where these guys do take power, and we've seen it in some European countries, but most obviously we've seen it recently in the US, these guys will also preside over an increase in wealth inequality, which will mean, again, a squeeze of assets away from the middle class, away from the working class, and further falls in ordinary families' living conditions. So these guys, whilst they will be very well funded, and they are very clearly in the ascendancy, they have a really, really serious weakness, which is they are literally impoverishing their own supporters. But this is not just the weakness of the political right, this is also the weakness of the political centre. I put a video out a few weeks ago saying Trump and Labour will both fail, because they will both allow wealth inequality to increase, which means the squeezing out of wealth from ordinary families to the rich. And as much as this movement is small and it's almost completely unfunded, the power that we have is both of our competitors are actively impoverishing their voter base, aggressively impoverishing their voter base. So I think we really, really have a chance by pushing a single message again and again and again. Wealth inequality is what is making you poor. The only way to protect your families from poverty is to get the wealth back from the very rich. That means fixing a broken tax system which taxes you at higher rates than them. It means changing the tax system to tax them more, to tax you less, tax wealth, not work. Now, I want to make it clear, because I'm in the business of predictions, what will happen if we don't get this onto the table. If we don't get this idea onto the table, then we will be left with essentially the two voices on the table that are already there, which is one, this kind of tired old centrism where we just say business, 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 growth, 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 entrepreneurship, entrepreneurship, entrepreneurship to ourselves again and again, a million times whilst we impoverish the working class. And this new right idea of the problem is immigrants, the problem is foreigners. And because you have only two basic ideas on the table, what you'll have is you'll get one party in power. So, for example, in this country, we currently have the boring centrists in power. They will oversee growth and inequality, and they'll become very unpopular, and they'll be replaced by the problem. And I want to talk a little bit about two ideas. One is the Overton window, and the other is message discipline. So the Overton window is an idea in politics, that there's a kind of window of ideas which are considered acceptable, sensible, normal, non-extreme at a given point in time. We've got some videos on this channel, maybe I'll link one in the description, talking about why economists don't talk about wealth inequality. The vast majority of economists are rich people who are not being hurt by this, that are benefiting from it, and they do not think inequality is a problem. That means that at the moment, focusing on and centralising inequality, wealth inequality as the core problem, is not popular with economists, and it's outside the Overton window. This really is the key challenge that we have. And people sometimes ask me, why don't Labour talk to you? Why don't Labour get this idea in their manifesto? Really, it comes down to, very simply, that answer. This is outside the Overton window. The group of people in this country and in most countries across the world who decide what is acceptable, what is sensible, what is wise, is a very small group of rich and posh people. And they've decided that this idea is simply unacceptable. We need to push back on that. But in order to do that, we need message discipline. So just the second concept I want to introduce. Message discipline is again another political idea. This is the reason why when politicians go on TV, they're always unbelievably, painfully boring, which is that they get told by the political party, if this subject comes up, you have to say this. And when they go on the TV, they're not really thinking, what's my opinion on that? What do I think about that? They're thinking, what has my political party told me to say about this issue? And for that reason, when politicians go on TV, they all say the exact same thing again and again and again and again and again. And the reason they do this is how you get an idea into the Overton window. If you say an idea again and again and again and again, and it's important that a variety of people say it, and then you guys out there hear 25 different posh-looking, smart-sounding people saying the same idea, the problem is immigrants, the problem is immigrants, the problem is immigrants, on the TV, then you start to believe that idea. This is how an idea goes from being crazy, wacky, unbelievable, no way true, to being common sense. An idea travels from being absolutely outrageous to being commonly accepted as common sense, simply by lots of people saying it again and again and again and again and again. Now, I'm not a political party, we don't have a political party, we will and are trying to influence the political parties. What I have is this YouTube channel and you. And we need to start using this message discipline now. I need to keep saying, and you need to keep saying, and you need to get your friends and your family to keep saying, obviously, the reason why you guys are getting poor is because of growing wealth inequality. And you can choose, when you push that message, either to use my name in my videos or not. So you can go to your friends and family and say, hey, look, there's this guy, Gary's Economics. I think
Again, so his solution, and we'll start to wrap it up, right, here, but his solution is, okay, if he can just get everyone to start saying this out loud, to start probably protesting in the streets, all these things, that it's not working out anymore, that it somehow will be solved. Again, we think it's a naive approach. We think that you have to take matters into your own hands and actually just realize this transition that he's hoping will happen in society, if it actually starts to happen, will take so long that it won't even benefit you. If you are ideologically, want a state to try and push this agenda, we completely agree it as well. But if you're a bit more, no, I'm just here to make a better life for me and my family, we think you have to go towards an approach like the Nomad Millionaire. We're not saying exactly ours, but you sort of have to realize, okay, when this is happening, when this trend is going, what you have to do is get into the same trend. And the way you do that for 98% of people out there is you use your salary as a weapon to build wealth. Your salary is your way to build wealth. And again, it can't be done in the UK anymore, or it's definitely a lot harder for most people. It's harder in Germany. It's harder in US. Why? Because after taxes and income, after taxes and housing cost, you essentially left most places with around 20% left of your paycheck. And then you also do other stupid things. You go out, you dine, and you also want to live life, right? And we completely get that. So by the end of the day, you live paycheck to paycheck like the rest of the society. And basically, in the US, 76% live paycheck to paycheck. In the UK, 70% of people live paycheck to paycheck. It's getting harder and harder for most people to retire. And the younger we get, the younger we go, the worse it looks. Like our parents in general, were on average now doing a lot better than the same generation when they were 30 years old. So what has happened here is just not. It's the first time around, or for at least in a long, long period of time, where this generation is not doing as well as the prior. And that is, of course, we can sit around crying about it, shouting about it. It doesn't really help us. What helps is we take the matter into our own hands and actually just realize, okay, I need to be on a plan that works for me and my family, or me and my loved ones. And that is essentially what we are here to try and help you do. Again, Gary here, watch this video. Gary's economics, clearly a very, very smart guy. And we completely agree with the problem that he has identified, and we completely agree with the messaging he has. We think it's naive approach for you to sit around and wait for the rich to start to give their wealth back to the middle class and the working class. We just don't believe that's going to happen. So all we say is join the capital class. And this will be small steps at first, but over time, this will start to compound for you. And that is essentially why we started Nomad Millionaire, is to realize, waiting around for this to change and suddenly UK becomes a place where the working class and the middle class can thrive. We think you'll end up in a worse place. We don't think this is going to change. We actually think the introduction of new technologies like AI, like crypto, and all other elements will actually drive this change, drive this disparity between the asset holders and the working class even further. So all we say is join. Don't cry about it. Realize this is the game you're in, and I have to get to a net savings rate of 50% every month for 5 years, and then I'm part of the capital class. And that's what you have to do. It sounds simple, but it is hard. And that's oftentimes the case. Any solution to a problem, oftentimes the solution is actually quite simple, but it's still hard to do. And we completely get that. But we still want you to just try and think about it. Go through the 8 steps and actually realize, okay, I now see light at the end of the tunnel. And that's what we're here to try and do. Thank you guys for joining me here and going through it. And again, Gary is clearly correct about essentially everything. And again, he might also be right that if enough people actually start to, that over time we can actually change this around. We think it's tough. We don't see how this is actually going to happen practically. If you start to say, don't to try and tax the rich a lot more, every time that has happened in the last years, what we've seen is people are moving. And the people with the most money has also easy access to move. And so we think that is not going to help. But we can be wrong around that. But again, even if he's right, it's going to take a long time to see that change. And for us, we want to do something today. We want this next month to be better than the prior month. We want life to start compounding now. Not just your wealth, but also all the other things in life that starts to compound when you get your money right. So again, guys, go ahead. Try and realize what is working for you, what is not. Figure out where you are today and get into a better place. Thank you for today, guys. And hey, Just an intro. Please like and subscribe. We're trying to get this message out to more people. We think we have a solution. We hope you'll follow it. We hope you will actually also share it and with other people as well. Thank you.